online participants. Good to have you tonight. Welcome to everybody who is in the room this evening. So this is our second night together for our four-part Lenten series, and it's good to see you. A little warmer and nicer tonight compared to last week. And it's lighter, right? Did you all hear the session? The Senate voted to keep daylight savings time year-round.
Yeah, because they like my granddaughter sitting at the bus stop in the dark.
There you go.
At 7
Anyway, we'll see
o'clock.
if it actually.
I like sunsets at 9:30 in the summer.
Summer. That's
Well, anyway, it's good to see everybody. And so, if you'll just join me in a moment of prayer, and then we'll get started. So let us pray. Gracious God, we do give you thanks for all of your mercies and for this day of life. With a day that promises spring and green things to come. Lord, as we gather this evening, we ask for your guidance and help and inspiration so that we can learn about the Bellheart Confession, and we can share and celebrate the grace that you have bestowed upon the world, and also, Lord, become more committed and serious about that call to inclusion and unity in the church, and to stand against racism and all the other isms that are out there that divide us. So be with us this evening in a special way so that we will all be able to learn and grow and deepen for the sake of your kingdom of grace and peace. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so I want to do just a quick review. Remember, we're talking about grace, and we said that our definition of grace, this is not a high-powered theological definition, but grace is God's unconditional, unearned love, welcome, the embrace of every human being, and I believe that this is the primary message of the good news of God. There's much more. But that's the primary message, that God's grace is not just meant for one group of people, it's meant for the entire world. Now, I believe, good Methodist that I am in my heart, that it does matter what we do with it and how we respond to this, but that God's grace is poured out for the entire world. And I think the Methodists call that prevenient grace, right, Bob? I think that's what you call it.
Well, yes. Amen.
Whatever you say. It's good enough. Anyway.
You're a good student of Wesley.
I like John Wesley. Okay, anyway, so that's grace. And then if you'll look on the front page there, we said there's a disconnect. There's a disconnect between what we believe, what we profess, the attributes of God, what we say we believe. There's a disconnect between what we say, what we believe, and how we interact with one another. And that disconnect is that if God's grace is for everybody, it's sort of the unifying thing that says if God's grace is good for that person or that person or that black person or that gay person or that other person, then we need to treat them as God's children. The image of God is in them, but do we always do that? We don't. And that's the disconnect. Whether it's the color of your skin or your socioeconomic status or anything else, whether we give voice to it or not, we tend to sometimes think we're either somehow superior or inferior to another person who is a recipient of this thing called grace. And that's the disconnect. But grace ties us together. Joe, does that help Joe a little bit, what the disconnect is? That was one of Joe's questions. I just want to make sure. And if you have questions or if you want some clarity from last week, please, raise your hand and we'll talk about it, okay? So that's the thing that holds us together, and that's the thing that we believe in the Bellheart Confession called them to say that racism and apartheid is heresy, because it goes against all of this. And we'll tease that out a little bit, okay? And then we worked. Go ahead, Steve.
So what do we do with the cliche? Therefore, but for the grace of God, I would.
I think that's a dumb cliche. It's a theologically inept cliche because it assumes God's grace fell on you but not on you. So that is a dumb cliche, and it would be good to get it out of our vocabulary or our repertoire. Thank you, Dr. Gorman. Yes, Mary Ann.
When the centurion came to Christ and asked him to heal his servant, the Roman army was brutal in enforcing the Pax Romana. But he didn't say anything about that. He commented on this man's faith and healed the servant and then let it go. He did not condemn him.
And because of this and the good news, he didn't look at him and go, well, you're a Roman, I can't help.
Yeah.
You're a child of God. You need help. I will help you. Yeah. Thank you, Mary. Great. Other questions or comments? Last week we worked through, and we said that the church, in times when there's great disconnects, we said that the church writes confessions, right? And that the confessions, there's different reasons for them, there's different purposes, they fulfill different needs. But that our church, the Presbyterian Church USA, has, what did I say, 12 confessional documents, okay? And these documents serve to respond to and speak to these disconnects that come along in our life and history. And one of the great disconnects was in South Africa with the doctrine of apartheid. And I hope you will find as interesting as I did about South Africa and how it came to be, and all these churches, especially the Dutch Reformed churches, supported apartheid based on older confessional documents that we'll talk about. But in our discussion of the Presbyterian Church's confessional documents, which are included in the what? Book of Confessions, which is the first book in our church constitution. Remember I said our church constitution consists of two different books, the Book of Confessions and the Book of Order, okay? But we have 12 of them in there. But we got through 9 of those, all the way up to the Theological Declaration of Barman, which I think is one of the most interesting confessional documents. And again, that one came out of the disconnect of Nazism and nationalism within the German Reformed churches. And some, not all, but some of the German Reformed pastors, Lutheran and Reformed Church, stood up and spoke to the issue and said that who is Lord and who is not? Jesus is Lord and Hitler is not. That was the essential message of the Theological Declaration of Barman, okay? So we finished up there, and we've just got a few more to do, so I want to cover those, and then we're going to lead into the Barman Declaration, and then I'm going to give you some history of South Africa that I found really, really fascinating, okay? So the next document in our Book of Confessions is one that some of you who've been around longer than I have will remember, the Confession of 1967. Were any of you in the Presbyterian Church when that one came about?
I was in high school.
You were in high school. Stevenson and Marion. Some of you remember this. This was the first big confession to come to the American church for a long, long time, other than the Barman Declaration. Okay, because the standards up to that point were what? The Westminster Confession, and the church said, "We're in a new era." What was the ism at that time that Americans were facing in the 60s? Racism. And the church said, we need a new statement. It is time to speak up and have a contemporary document of faith. Why? Because the Westminster Confession didn't speak to that issue.
Well, you had Jim Crow laws all over the South.
Yes, absolutely.
In the Presbyterian churches.
Well, that's why there was a Southern Presbyterian Church and a Northern Presbyterian Church, because one said the Bible said it's okay to have slaves, and the other church said it was not.
But not by 1967.
No. Okay, so Confession of 67, this was a new confessional document. They wanted to reflect new developments in biblical scholarship and history. By that time, great strides have been made in archaeology and history and all those sorts of things since the Westminster Confession. So it was time to do that and to look again at the biblical statements and those sorts of things. So it was a teaching document. trying to help the church find its place in a new and different world, the world of the 60s and the 70s. And then the theme of that one was reconciliation, bringing people together, bringing people together. And believe it or not, that I did not know this, maybe Stevenson did. I didn't know that the Presbyterian Church did not have a book of confessions until then.
That's when it started.
Yeah, the book of confessions started then. We had confessions, but there really wasn't a book of confessions. And then they decided what's going to go in that book. So we started with the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creeds, and all those creeds. But that's when the book of confessions came together and included those confessions. But I didn't know that. The next one, the next confessional document in our denomination came when? Anybody know?
1991.
Yeah, this is when I came in. No, not to.
83 was.
Well, 83 was the Union of the Churches. That's when I became a Presbyterian right after the Union of the Churches. I was not raised in the Presbyterian Church, but I became a Presbyterian when the General Assembly was in Indianapolis. Was the first General Assembly when the two were together. That was the Union General
I thought they were in
Assembly.
Atlanta for that.
I thought it was in Indianapolis. It was, or maybe that's when the creed was started. I don't know. But at any rate, it was this big thing. It was this huge thing, and I was a newbie Presbyterian. I was so excited about the whole thing. But the two denominations, basically Southern and Northern, there's some little, came together in one church, the Presbyterian Church.
They literally had both General Assemblies walk to a joint spot. So it was acted out by the people who were the commissioners. It was pretty cool.
Yeah. So that was in, because that's
I think 83.
Oh, that's when we had assemblies every year. I forgot. So the next year was when it was in Indianapolis. That was the first year when it was just one church at the new gym. Okay,
Right.
so I was kind of right. Okay. Anyway, so the reason that church,
I'm older,
the reason that document came about was why we have a new denomination. It's time for a new statement of faith, because at that point, the most recent one was way back in 1967. So a new church, it's time to say a new thing. And I remember there was a lot of squabbling. It took a long time to get the brief statement of faith. It wasn't approved until 1991. So the denominations were joined in 83, but the brief statement of faith, which was a result of that, it took a while longer for it to finally be approved by all the presbyteries, because I think it takes a 2/3 vote of all the presbyteries after a General Assembly votes to change the Constitution, which includes the Book of Confessions. So it took a while for that to happen.
It's harder to change the Book of Confessions
Then
than
the
it is
Book
to
of
change
Order.
the Book of Order.
Yeah. The Book of Confessions, I think, takes a 2/3 majority, I think. And then the other one takes only a half or something.
Steve said it's easier to change the Bible than
It actually is. Yeah, it
I don't know that he was saying that to everybody.
I have a neighbor who was a member of the Bible Presbyterian Church.
There was a Bible, it's no longer in existence, I don't think.
I don't
There was
think
a-
so, but it's
yeah.
very, the Bible says
Well,
it.
they're fundamentalists.
Yeah.
They believe the Bible's inerrant. Yeah. Yeah, there are some very, very, very small Presbyterian denominations like that. There's a few. Okay. Any other questions about the brief statement of faith? You're actually somewhat familiar with it. We do use it occasionally. It's a great document for worship. It's a great worship piece. And they wrote it to flow in a worship service. Okay. One then is the Confession of Delhar. And this was added to the Book of Confessions, approved by the churches and the presbyteries in 2016. What I had forgotten, though, was that it failed in 2008. Why? It was tried. The General Assembly approved it in 2008, but guess what? They couldn't get the 2/3 majority required of the presbyteries. The presbyteries, they ratified it, and they couldn't get that 2/3 majority, so they went back at it, and it was finally approved in 2016.
Why was there such dissension then? And what was the problem?
There was some theological discontent with it. the one thing I read said that one of the arguments was, well, if you use this argument for racism, you could use it for anything, in any argument, any disconnect, which doesn't make sense to me, but that was part of the problem. And probably there was racism involved in it. There were people who just didn't want that to be in the Book of Confessions, or felt that it was, although it's very biblical. The copy I'm going to give you maybe tonight, every single line has biblical references to it. It's a very biblical document. So I don't have a really good answer for you, Joe, but I know it did fail the first time. It didn't pass all the presbyteries.
Don't you think, too, there was a sense of, if we keep doing this, we're going to have to keep doing this? And it's like, we're having an avalanche of confessions. What's the next big problem going to be?
There will be one sometime.
Yeah, and
there
so
will
it's
be.
just people, they were kind of confession out.
Yeah. Probably not for 10, 15 years, but there will be another one at some point.
War.
Yeah. Okay, so now what I would like to do is talk a little bit about the background that led up to that Confession of Delhar. It's very interesting. So the Bellheart Confession is actually, it's a protest. It's a theological protest against apartheid in South Africa. It's a protest against what the Dutch Reformed Mission Church said was a heresy. And the heresy is this. The heresy is that the gospel, the good news we proclaim, is not able to reconcile races. That was the feeling in South Africa among the Reformed churches. The Dutch Reformed Church was the church in South Africa. And they said, they're claiming that the gospel of God's grace is not big enough and inclusive enough to bring the races together. And they blamed it on 3 other confessional documents, one of which is in our Book of Confessions. The South African churches had what they call 3 standards. They had I gotta look at this. The Belgic Confession, which I frankly have never read. I really don't know what it's about. The Heidelberg Catechism, which is in our Book of Confessions, and then the Canons of Dort, which are more Calvinistic than Calvin ever was. But apparently in those confessional documents, it says this. It says that Reformed Protestant Christians are not anarchists. They're not out there to overturn governments, especially Roman Catholic monarchs. That's not what we're trying to do. And they said that Jesus and both Paul said that we are to obey the civil authorities and the civil governments. He did say that. And so they used that, which was in the confessions and in the Bible, and said, therefore, the Reformed Church cannot stand against the civil authorities of South Africa and against this thing that was set up called apartheid. So they used selected scriptures, interpreted carefully, and there are 3 confessional documents to say apartheid will stand. It is what it is, and it's in our gospel and the confessions are not big enough to reconcile the races and bring the races together. Okay, so that's what it is, and I'll say more about that. That's what it is. Okay, it's not big enough to do that, and therefore, Dutch Reformed, especially Dutch Reformed black Christians, said that it was a heresy. It was a heresy of the white Dutch Reformed Church, which was an entirely another denomination. It was like the denomination that ran everything. All of the big muckety mucks were Dutch Reformed. Some were Anglicans, but most were Dutch Reformed. Okay, they used these selective scriptures and those 3 confessional documents to basically excuse and permit apartheid. All right. All 3 asserted that Reformed Christians were not social national anarchists. We're not out to upset governments. We obey the government, they said. But it was just a way to excuse and to permit something they all wanted, which was white supremacy in South Africa. Okay? So the conclusion was, if civil authorities forbid the mixing of races, whether in public facilities, you could not, a black person, a white person could not get married. After a while, white children or black children could not go to white schools. So if the civil authorities forbid it, then the church, obeying the scriptures and the confessional documents, must conform. That was the argument. That was it. In 1978, the Dutch, there was a small black denomination called the Dutch Reformed Mission Church. They were kicked out of the Dutch Reformed Church back in the 1860s. Why? To get the blacks out of the church. So that the Dutch Reformed Church would be a white church. So the Dutch Reformed Mission Church was the black daughter church of the Dutch Reformed Church. They had their own seminary, and it was near Cape Town, I believe. At any rate, in 1978, one of the professors, his name was Jacques Duran, was teaching a class, and at that point, all the black people wanted to get rid of apartheid, right? And everybody had reasons. It's wrong, it's morally wrong, it's cruel, it's whatever. And finally, the theology professor says, tell me why, biblically and theologically, it's wrong. That's what we're here to do, right? We're in a seminary, we're in a theological seminary. Tell me why this is wrong based on Scripture and our Reformed theology. And 2 or 3 days later, 2 or 3 of the students came up and they said, because it's a heresy. It's a heresy. It is a heresy that says the gospel of Jesus Christ is not big enough or inclusive enough to reconcile the races. And that's a heresy, okay? And the professor thought it was so good that he moved it along to this fellow named Alan Bozak. Remember him? He was, I think he was the president of the Synod of the World Alliance of Reformed Churches. Bozak was president, and they got this in front of Bozak, and Bozak was like, "This is good stuff. This is really, really good stuff." And the World Alliance of Reformed Churches said that apartheid is anti-evangelical, and by that it means it's anti-good news. It's anti all of this good news. And they said it's a structural and institutional sin. And furthermore, the next thing the World Alliance of Reformed Churches did, we are a member of the World Alliance of Reformed Churches. At that point, the Dutch Reformed Church, everybody was. There was like 200 denominations in this world gathering of Reformed and Presbyterian Christians. Guess what they did? They voted to boot out the Dutch Reformed Church from the World Alliance of Churches. They did it. They voted and they did it. And as they did it, they announced something that I learned about from good old Jack Rogers. He said, and this is true for all of the confessions, what happened was what is called in theological circles a status confessionis or something like that, right? In other words, it's time to make a statement. It's time to declare the faith. In the midst of this disconnect called apartheid and racism, it is time for the church to speak up and correct this. A status confessionis. And that's when they moved in to beginning to write out a new confession. And it became the Bellheart Confession. Why? Because Bellheart is a little town or suburb around Johannesburg, I think, where it was written. That's where the name comes from. All right? So a status confessionis was declared by the World Alliance of Reformed Church. The gospel is at stake. The church has to speak in a new time with a new statement. think that's pretty cool, all right? That was in 1982, okay? So it took from 1978 to 1982 to boot out the Dutch Reformed Church and to declare this, okay? So it took a while. And the Dutch Reformed Mission Church then set up a committee to write this new confession. And it was headed by, there were two people who were like co-chairs. I don't know if I've got their names or not. I don't think I did. There were two people who were named as co-chairs, but a committee wrote the thing. And apparently they did it like in 3 or 4 days. It was very quick. They
So
did it
what was the
during one of their
difference between
synods.
that and the original one done by the students?
The students didn't write the confession. They simply declared that it was a heresy. They named the theological heresy. He says, tell me why you think it's wrong theologically and biblically. And so, but they didn't write the full confession. The full confession was written by a committee of the Dutch Reformed Mission Church, the Black Church. Okay? Took 4 more years for they do the same thing we do. When a new statement comes out and they want to change their book of order, it goes to what their General Assembly is, and then it has to be approved by all of their presbyteries or whatever they call them there. And so it took a while, but it was approved by the Dutch Reformed Mission Church in 1986. Okay. One of the committee chairs his name was Russell Botman, black guy. Guess what happened to him after they approved it? The government put him in jail and tortured him just for this document. Why they didn't go after the other guy, I don't know. He must have been mouthier, I don't know. But so one of the theologians that wrote this thing, he was put in prison and tortured there.
There's a lot of parallels to
The Barman. They said the Barman and the Belhar are remarkably similar. They both end with Jesus as Lord, by the way. I'm guessing they looked at the Barman and
But there's a lot of
a
historical.
lot of similarities, yeah.
parallels.
And guess what the white apartheid supporters said about the document, the Bellheart Confession? You know what they called it? Communist. They said it was a communist document, which, say the word communist and gets everybody's back up, right? They said it was communist. I don't know how you could look at that and say it was
Well, there
communist.
were people who said that about the Confession of 67.
Yeah.
Just throw that word out.
Yeah, it's a good word. I mean, it's not a good word. It's an effective word. It gets done things that you don't want. Anyway, so yeah, they said it was communist. Whatever. And it was compared to Barman. Jesus is Lord of the church and of the conscience. No one is Lord over us or our church, including the government of South Africa. Okay? Questions or comments about that? That is a very high-level overview, but that's how it happened. It happened in a little theological seminary, a little black seminary, where the professor said, I hear you griping and complaining, and yes, it's unethical, and it's cruel, and it's immoral, but tell me why it's wrong biblically and theologically. And those students went to work and came up with it because it's a heresy. It's a heresy based on the gospel of Christ, and that the gospel, the Christian faith, is all about reconciliation, bringing people together. Okay? Now, what I want to do is back up, 400 years, 500 years, and go back to the founding of South Africa and how this mess happened. How did this happen? How did this get to be the way it was? Does anybody know the story? If you do, be quiet and I'll tell it to you. Okay, all right. So I have a very old-fashioned, technical teaching aid here. Okay, so this is South Africa. It's the bottom of the continent of Africa, right? This is the Cape of Good Hope right there. All right. So what happened was the Dutch up here started colonizing in Asia. Remember that you've heard the Dutch East India Company? Mm-hmm. The Dutch were very, very commerce oriented. And so they set up these colonies, and they decided it'd really be good to have a point somewhere along the way for safety, a place where we could stop and rest and, repack and get more food and water and all that kind of stuff. And so there's the Cape. They had to sail around this thing to say, well, that might as well be the halfway point, right? This was before the Suez Canal, before they could cut across this way. So, and they had, the Dutch had colonies in Madagascar and in different places in Asia, in Indonesia, okay? So this was kind of the halfway point, all right? So they went there and they marched in, took the place over. The indigenous tribe that was there, called the Khoi or something like that, they sort of pushed them north. Yeah, that'd be north, even if it's in the southern hemisphere, right? Okay, north, pushed them north, deeper into the country. And they set up a little like a Jamestown kind of place there. And all that was like in 1650, something like that, 1652. And they were all Dutch Reformed Protestants. They were all Dutch Reformed Protestants doing this, okay? They also, some of them decided, this is a pretty good place, we could push a little farther north and we could have some farms, and some of us like to farm, and we could do that. And so they started pushing north. And they needed help. They needed help to start these farms, right? But they wanted nothing to do with the indigenous tribes. The Dutch wanted nothing to do with the black indigenous tribes that were there. So what they do, they brought in their slaves and indentured servant from their colonies in Madagascar and then in Indonesia. They brought them in to help them farm. And they had guns, and they just used guns and power, and they pushed the tribes north out of here. And they just kept taking more and more and more land. Now, at the same time, the language being spoken is Dutch, right? But after, 100 years or so, the language started to change. And they started calling it Cape Dutch. It was a much simpler version of Dutch. It wasn't the High Dutch. And so the language started to change, okay? Guess what else happened? Some of those good white Dutch Reformed Protestant men started, no, they didn't marry them. They didn't marry them. They just raped them and had babies.
Right.
Yeah.
Kind of like in our South.
Yeah. So they started having these babies, and they called the babies colors because they weren't white, they weren't black. They called them colors. There's something in between. These babies were called colors. Of course, they didn't intermarry at that point, but eventually, those children started to marry into the indigenous tribes. So you're getting all these different flavors, right? White, black, mocha, all that starting to happen, okay? Now, yeah, they called them the colors. The mixed race were the colors. The white Dutch people that were moving north, they were called Boers. That might mean farmer in Dutch. Does anybody know? B-O-E-R-S. They call them the Boers. And they are the ones that wanted land and wanted to set up their farms like they have in the Netherlands. The Boers. They moved deeper and deeper into the north. And again, the Dutch language just kept morphing, Cape Dutch or whatever. The British saw a good thing happening down there. And so, in 1795, the British invaded and conquered the Cape. And suddenly it's under English rule. It's under English rule. And English was declared the official language, not Dutch or Cape Dutch, English. Which had to be pretty unsettling to people who didn't know the English language, right? And also that's when the Anglican Church landed. Remember Bishop Tutu? He wasn't Dutch Reformed, he was an Anglican bishop. So in comes the Anglicans at that point. And get this, there were 15,000 people around the Cape. 10,000 of them were either black or colored. So the white people, the Dutch and the English, 5,000 of them were running the show. Okay. So white supremacy is already present. It's already there. It's already there. The whites ruled the indigenous people and the colors, these mixed races. Okay. But here's a good thing. In 1828, the British Parliament said, this isn't right. You can't have slavery. You have to offer, all laws have to pertain to everybody, whether you're English, Dutch, colored, or indigenous. That was in 1828. The problem was, though, what they did is what they did in the American South. They just simply replaced it with that you couldn't have slaves or indentured servants, but you just set up these terrible laws and rules that kept people apart, like the Jim Crow laws. Yeah, there's no slavery, but we're going to make your life. We're going to stay in power. We are in charge of this. So that's what they did. Slavery was abolished, but institutional and structural racism just dug roots deeper. Okay. And in 1830, it was declared that English was the only language that could be used in the courts or in the governmental systems. So Dutch, Cape Dutch, all of it could not be used, had to use English. The Boers, these settlers up here, what did they speak? They spoke Cape Dutch, which eventually became this language called Afrikaners. Afrikaners. It morphed into an official language finally. They call it, it's not Cape Dutch, it's called Afrikaners. And that's what the original descendants of those farmer settlers, that's what they spoke. So there's this war kind of going on between the English, who are running the place now, because the Britain's in charge of it, and the Dutch who had settled it and didn't like it, and then all the indigenous people, and then all the mixed race people. It's a real mess. And they just kept, so they tried to outrun the English, they just kept moving deeper north, farther north. And then something else interesting happened. In the 1860s, they started bringing over Indians, people from India, again, to work because they needed help. And they didn't want anything to do with the black people, and not really anything to do with the colored people. So the Indians started coming, and they came, like, within 40 years, there were 150,000 Indians in South Africa, right? One of them was who? Mahatma Gandhi. Mahatma Gandhi went there, again, to try to help the Indians who were being oppressed by the white people, both the English and the Boers. By 1867, black children could not go to public schools. They didn't have their own schools. They were pushed out of the public schools, and that's when the Dutch Reformed Church created this daughter church called the Dutch Reformed Mission Church. Because at this point, the separation of the races was becoming so apparent, they said, you got to get out of the churches now. So they found this new Dutch Reformed Church just for black people. It's called the Mission Church. Okay, does that make sense? All right, so you've got them out of the churches. You've got the black people out of the schools, out of the churches, every place else. And that's also when Cape Dutch became known as Afrikaans. The other thing that happened in the late 1800s was the discovery of gold and diamonds. We've all heard about the gold and diamonds out of South Africa. That was discovered in the 1870s. And guess who wanted the gold and diamonds? It was all up in the north where the Boers were, the Dutch, the English. So the English, they saw another good thing, and they moved up there and they took over the gold mines and the diamond mines, which just more and more problems.
That's where we get the disaster of Cecil Rhodes.
Yeah. They took it over. They took over the mining industry. The English did. And then another weird thing that happened is that 3 areas in the south along here all united into one group that eventually became the beginning of the country of South Africa, the nation of South Africa. It was called the Union of South Africa. So 3 of these areas, provinces, states, whatever they called them, came together. That was in 1907. In 1910, they had the gall to declare independence from Britain. They declared independence from Britain. But before all that happened, the English came in and they decided that they had to put these Boers down. And that was the Boers' War, 1899 Boer War. 500,000 English soldiers went to this area to put down the old Dutch farmer settlers. Anybody here like Downton Abbey? What was the Lord of the House? What was his name?
Lord Bransford.
Yes, he fought in the Boer War. Really? In the show. Yeah, he was in the Boers War.
That's where Britain's commanders in World War I all
They
got
fought
their
there and then
initial
they went to
fighting
World War.
there.
And they went to World War I. Yeah. But anyway, so the English crushed them. They just crushed them. But at any rate, in 1910, they declared independence from Britain, and Britain really didn't fight back at that point. They just let it go. In 1948, all those old Dutch settlers, which are now called Afrikaners, that the old white Dutch are called Afrikaners, guess what? Somehow they managed, even though there weren't many of them, like 12% of the population, somehow they managed to get a majority in their governmental system, their parliament system, or however it works, and they took the country over. So after all those years, the old Dutch settlers took the country back and were in charge now. The English were no longer in charge. But that's when the real horrible stuff started. Because those old Dutch white people did not like black people or colored people. That's when it really started to get ugly. All right? Does that make sense? The Dutch Reformed Church, which was the establishment state church, fully supported strict separation of the races, including public schooling, the whole thing. And again, it was based on the Bible, their interpretation of the Bible, and those three old confessional documents, Dort, Heidelberg, and the Belgic Confession. And that was their theological basis to support apartheid. The other thing they did was they started requiring black and colored people to have they call them passbooks. And wherever you went, you had to have, because anybody could say, let me see your passbook, who are identification. To keep track of everybody, they call them passbooks. That led to a couple really bad massacres a bit later. Before we get to that though, in 1949, after the Afrikaners took over the national government, Nelson Mandela, another guy, Oliver Tambo, and another one, Walter Sisulu, they were all black lawyers. They started to oppose apartheid, right? Started to speak up, and they were like national leaders against apartheid. In 1960, I was trying to find, 64, Mandela, who was in 64, that Mandela was sentenced to life in prison just because he was against apartheid. But before we get to the massacre, anybody remember that? The Sharpsville Massacre. That happened when a bunch of people decided they were going to burn their passbooks. They weren't going to be treated like this. And it was a peaceful gathering. No one was armed, it was a peaceful gathering, but they were going to either burn their passbooks or just turn them in at some public building. Well, the police came down on them, and there were 67 unarmed people that were killed by white police. Another 186 were wounded. As they were running away, almost all of them were shot in the back by the white police. They call it the Sharpsville Massacre. A few years later, Mandela goes to prison, and then later, in 1970, Mandela's in prison this whole time. 1976, another one of these terrible massacres happened, called the Soweto Uprising. Remember that? Even I remember that. It was a shanty town. It was a black and colored shanty town by Johannesburg. what happened was there was an edict that everybody had to be taught. Now remember, the Afrikaners are now in charge of the country. They said, no, you can't teach in English, now you have to teach in Afrikaner, the old Dutch, Cape Dutch, which children and teachers, they had no idea how to speak Cape Dutch or Afrikaner. But because the Afrikaners were in charge, they wanted that to be the official language of the country, and so it caused all this terrible stuff. And they had a rally to oppose it, and 500 people were killed, including children. 500 people were killed by the Afrikaner white police. At that point, the United Nations stepped in, and remember, they condemned the whole thing. They condemned the South African government and apartheid, and there was an arms embargo against South Africa. So the whole world now is against this thing called apartheid.
And a lot of boycotts and disinvestment.
Yeah. Sort of like what's happening with Russia, how the whole world is turning against
exactly.
Russia. Same thing happened in South Africa. The whole world just turned against this country with what they were doing. But it happened after the United Nations spoke up and condemned them. Which is just about the time that all those black students were in that little seminary, that little Dutch Reformed Mission Church seminary, angry and hurting. They had been oppressed, their families had been killed and shot, and that's when the professor said, so tell me, biblically and theologically, why we should stand against apartheid. And that's where the Bellheart Confession had its beginning, right there. Okay? Now the good news starts. So in 1990, remember President de Klerk? He became the president of the country, and he knew apartheid was over, and so it was over, and he released Mandela. Remember when Mandela got out of prison? In 1993, they had their first free, or no, I may be wrong with that. No, 1994, they had their first truly free democratic election. And guess who got elected president? Mandela got elected president. But the cool thing was that Mandela chose de Klerk as his vice president. He was trying to reconcile. He was trying to practice what he preached. He was trying to reconcile. So de Klerk, who had ended apartheid, he became his vice president. All the races voted, and Mandela won, of course. At that same time, two of those little black Reformed churches merged, the Dutch Reformed Mission Church and another one called the Reformed Church of Africa or something like that. They were too small. They combined into one denomination, which is now called the Uniting Reformed Church in South Africa. United Reformed Church in South Africa. And in 1998, here's some other good news. So apartheid's over. The government is being run by a black man. He's the president of the country. Finally, in 1998, after all those years, the Dutch Reformed Church, which was booted out of the World Alliance of Reformed Churches years earlier, finally repudiated apartheid and racism. 1998. And of course, they were readmitted to the World Alliance of Reformed Churches. So they repented of their sins and repudiated it all. And in 1999, Mandela retired as president. And he died, what, 3 years ago? 4 years ago?
He's passed away.
Yeah.
Something like 3 or 4 years ago? he died?
Actually, it's been like, Camorra, it's like 2016.
Really? So it's been longer.
De Klerk died last year.
But I remember when Mandela died, yeah. So that's the history that led up to those seminary students being challenged to find a biblical and theological reason. They did, and then it grew and grew, and finally the committee was established and wrote the Bellheart Confession. I've also found out that there were many denominations that did adopt the Bellheart long before we did. Did you know that? The Reformed Church of America adopted it like in 98 or something like that, 99, something like that. What's the other Reformed church? The Christian Reformed Church, they adopted it. A couple of European Reformed churches adopted it long before we did, they did, which is kind of sad. It took that long for us to adopt the Bellheart
I think it's
Confession.
because we were preoccupied with the brief statement of faith.
Yeah, it could be. Yeah, probably true.
Well,
We've been busy with that one.
you know, I've been reflecting on this, my past memories of some of the arguments that were going on. And given the history you've just given us, which is a great overview of what was going on, there were American Presbyterians who were saying, this is a confession for South Africa.
Not for us.
It's not for us. And because and the bigger term they used was the universality of confessions. That if confessions are not for the whole world,
Okay.
you can say this is a wonderful document, and it does, you know,
But we should adopt it.
but it doesn't really deserve. It doesn't rise to the level of being a confession for our book of confessions.
Yeah.
It's simply a really neat statement that the
Yeah.
Presbyterian Church can say as
And
a
it was, I'm sure the argument was it's a local issue. It's not our issue.
Yeah.
Which the same thing could be said of the Barman Declaration.
Sure.
You know, that was a local issue in Germany and Europe, not here. But yeah, so Steve, for all of you online who didn't hear him, Steve was saying that as he's remembering now that one of the arguments in the American church for not adopting the Belhar was, you know, that's a South African confession, that's a South Africa issue, apartheid is a South Africa issue. You know, we're really not racists or anything. So that's why it took longer. But the Presbyterian Church USA, the General Assembly, in I think it was 2008, did vote to adopt it. But when it got to the Presbyteries, it was defeated because it didn't get the 2/3 majority. They got a majority of Presbyteries, but not the 2/3. They were like 8 short or something. And then it took a while, but then eventually ran it through again, did some education on it, a lot of education in the Presbyteries and the churches. It passed the 2016, or the, would have been a 2015 Journal Assembly, whatever it was. And then the Presbyteries adopted it. So it finally landed our Book of Confessions in 2016. Very interesting. So any questions about that? I just found all that history that I didn't really know about South fascinating. How did they get into such a mess? You know, how did that mess happen? But it was just cultures coming together and conflicts and who wants to be in charge and, you know, power issues and all that sort of stuff.
What about Desmond Tutu? Now, he's Anglican, I know.
I mean, he's dead too.
He has died,
Yeah.
but he was a great person on love and God's love. I mean, we have books that he's written
Oh,
in
yeah,
our
absolutely.
library.
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
yeah.
It's just that because he was an Anglican bishop, and Anglicans aren't big on confessional documents. He really wasn't a part of the Bellheart Confession. And he wasn't a part of the Reformed Church.
No, he wasn't.
He was Anglican. But he was one of the Christian leaders that stood against it. But I mean, he was also black too.
Well, yeah, but when the books that we have from him are wonderful.
Yeah.
Or, you know, was he black or was he a colored?
Well, I don't know, but I was going to say, I read Trevor Noah's autobiography, and his mom was black, and his dad was white. They couldn't be married. And he's a pretty young guy, you know.
Yeah.
But when he would go to his grandmother's, it was like she had to hide him because colored people weren't supposed to be in that part. I mean, that's an interesting book to read for something pretty current, really.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
So even he
frequently,
remembers that.
both races are opposed to interracial marriages. I mean, you have black people that don't want their children to marry white people, and you have white people that don't want their children.
But it was the law back then.
Yeah, right,
Yeah.
right.
When did that law change here? It depends on the state.
It depends on the state, because it's state ordinance.
State laws. They were-
Some of them technically happen
Really?
Yeah.
Like what, in the 70s, 60s?
Yeah.
later.
Really?
Later.
Wow. So I'm going to stop there. It's 5 to 8. So if I give you a copy of the Bellheart Confession, will you promise me you'll bring it back next week so I don't have to do more copying? Okay.
Yeah.
So this copy actually has all of the biblical references. Okay. So I'll pass down this. So if you want to, it's not long. It's not really long at all. But just bring it back so that we can look at it and make more copies.
There was this huge
But is
division.
there an assignment to read it?
Sure. Your assignment is to read it. Yeah, go ahead, because we're going to start digging into it. So you might as well, we'll read the first half or something, but it's not, you can read it in 5 minutes. Yes.